Hello Varlets, this is the updated Cinder Mage build that I've been using to climb Havoc this season, and if you look closely, you'll notice that there are some points missing from the talent tree. That's because, after some much experimentation, I've come to the conclusion that there are many ways to make this long-standing meta build tailored to your own needs. So, stick around and we'll explore a couple of variations, and take a look at the commonly asked question of whether Rending is actually good on this build or not, and whether you should bother about it. So let's get it on. Starting with our melee weapon of choice, I have chosen to go with the Deimos Force Sword. You can of course go with the Dueling Sword if you'd like, but other good options are also the Combat Blade and even the Great Force Grade Sword. For perks, I've built mine up with Maniac Damage to deal with mutants, which I have a personal vendetta against, especially in Havoc. I've also taken Carapace Damage for dealing primarily with Crushers. For blessings, I've chosen Deflector for a layer of defense against range attacks if I find myself out of position, and I've also chosen Uncanny Strike to deal with Crushers as well. For my Inferno Staff, I have mine built with Flag Damage for dealing with the majority of elites, and Crit Chance to help our Soul Blaze application rate. For those who don't know, a crit from an Inferno Staff applies 2 stacks of Soul Blaze instead of 1. If you want to learn more about the ins and outs of the staff, I have a dedicated review video on it should you wish to explore more. For blessings, I have Blaze Away, which is the most powerful blessing on it by far, as well as Penetrating Flames. This is something we'll take a closer look at in the rending section of the video, so we'll circle back to it then. Now, let's move on to the talent tree. I have for you here what I deem to be the core nodes for the build, and while I won't take you through every single node, I will explain why I've chosen some of the nodes over others and why I might have not included certain nodes as part of the core build. Let's start with Metal. This used to be a go-to node before the Bound by Duty update, because it used to recover a flat 5% toughness every time you scored a crit. Now, while it does recover 10% toughness, it does so over 4 seconds, which is effectively 2.5% toughness per second. For this build in particular, we're already getting a lot of toughness over time, so what we need is more instant toughness recovery, which is why we're opening the build with Soul Stealer instead. I have also chosen Brain Rupture and Kinetic Flayer. While this update did individually buff both of these nodes, together they are even stronger than before. I think any build that uses Brain Burst as a blitz should absolutely take Kinetic Flayer because it represents such a huge boost in potential single target damage to any build. We're also taking Empiric Shock because not only does it significantly increase our Brain Rupture damage, but it also helps our Soul Blaze deal with tanky targets like monsters and Ogre enemies a little better. Small piece of advice, if you see Rages in the middle of their combo, use your primary fire to knock them out of it and stun them in place with continuous puffs. This effectively shuts down any melee rush against you. Keep that in mind. When it comes to this part of the tree, I have chosen Anticipation simply because I want the extra dodge count. The increased dodge duration is not the most impactful thing to have since it just keeps you in the dodge state from 0.2 seconds to 0.3, which is hardly a noticeable improvement all things considered. I also chose Anticipation instead of One with the Warp and Just a Dream because of how I play this build, which is very defensive. I'm either near cover, behind my team, or playing inside my bubble, and this means I'm very rarely at risk of getting shot in the first place. Since both One with the Warp and Just a Dream only have value if you actually take hits, I find taking the extra dodge to outright prevent getting hit in the first place to be a bit more of value to me. Moving on, you might notice that Sanctuary isn't highlighted as a core to this build. This isn't because I think it doesn't have value, it most certainly does. But having played some games with and without it on Havoc 40, Sanctuary's value is dependent on how good your team is as well. If you have a team with Shout and Chorus and they're doing a good job of keeping gold toughness up, then Sanctuary has less value for you since you are protected anyway. But if your team is more conservative with their toughness regeneration tools, then having Sanctuary helps a lot to keep your toughness topped off. Personally, I like having it, but I also understand the value of the bubble is in its 360 range damage protection and not so much the toughness regeneration, nice as it is. Finally, Vulnerable Minds is a node which I thought about heavily when it came to adding it into the core build. On one hand, dealing with monsters and Ogre enemies, mainly Crushers, isn't really your job as the Inferno Psyker. In Havoc, whenever a monster spawns, it brings with it a horde of enemies as well. So it's your job to hold the horde back so your team has the space to deal with the monsters. So, if you don't have Vulnerable Minds as part of your build, the role you play as the Inferno Psyker practically is unchanged. But on the other hand, Vulnerable Minds acts as an additional damage multiplier for your Brain Rupture to magnify, further increasing its ability to deal heavy damage to monsters especially. In this case, taking it helps make up for the shortfall of the build and is why I consider it part of the core build. The rest of the nodes are pretty self-explanatory for an Inferno Staff build. Now, with the remaining talent points, we have some choices to make. We can either build into more defense, which is good for newer Psykers still learning how to not instantly die when playing in the higher levels, or we can build for more consistency and round out the build, which is my preferred choice. For the defensive path, we're going to take both Immaterial Focus and One with the Warp. Immaterial Focus provides 10% damage resistance that double dips since it benefits both toughness and health. One with the Warp immediately adds another 10% toughness damage resistance at a minimum and can scale up as your peril rises. We'll augment this with Warp Ghost to help keep our peril at high enough threshold to benefit consistently. The additional stamina provided allows for more blocking, and the increased toughness replenishment helps with keeping your toughness up. Lastly, we'll also take Sanctuary to create a safe space for recovery when needed. These additional layers of defense make you a little more difficult to go down and should provide more breathing room to recover from mistakes. If you are more confident in your abilities as a Psyker in staying alive, then the consistency build is probably going to benefit you more than having additional defenses. To build into more consistency, we're simply going to remove Immaterial Focus and one with the Warp from the defensive build and reallocate one of those points into Empiric Resolve. Empiric Resolve is going to provide a massive 40% reduction to our peril costs, giving us a total of 50% peril resistance when paired with Battle Meditation. This effectively cuts our casting cost in half, which allows for more flexible casting when playing at the 80% peril threshold. I know there was a Reddit thread some months back that explored the use of Empiric Resolve for additional DPS output, but what we really want from this node is to reduce the mental load of managing peril. The more wiggle room you have with your peril, the less you need to focus on not blowing up yourself by accident. This means you can focus on other things like your positioning, enemy spawns, combat flow, and looking out for your teammates better. And the more difficult and hectic your missions get, the more valuable having reduced peril becomes. This also means your quelling efficiency, the value you get from each tick of quelling, is increased substantially since you're able to cast twice instead of once when playing at near critical peril. I know some of you might balk at the minus 30% toughness replenishment from Empiric Resolve, but when paired with Warp Ghost's 25% extra toughness replenishment, we can dampen the negative impacts from it. This won't be a case of minus 30% plus 25% equals minus 5% penalty. No. Warp Ghost's benefits are additive, while the penalty from Empiric Resolve is multiplicative. This means we will ultimately have a minus 12% toughness replenishment penalty, leaving us with 88% efficiency, which is much more manageable in my opinion. I also know that some of you might be wondering why not take Inner Tranquility when we are building into Warp Siphon anyway, and the answer is simple: consistency. While Inner Tranquility does give a stronger peril resistance with no drawbacks, the inherent nature of this build is to drop bubbles and create safe spaces for your team to fight under. This means your main source of peril resistance will be ebbing and flowing throughout the mission as you gain and lose Warp Siphon charges. You can absolutely choose to use Inner Tranquility instead of Empiric Resolve if you'd like, but I personally like the 50% peril reduction throughout my mission no matter what. It also means I don't have to worry about losing warp charges, which is one less thing to think about. And I can also develop much better muscle memory because I'll be casting with the same peril cost throughout the mission, throughout all my games using this build. In essence, I've made a build that takes very little thinking, use even less thinking, so you can focus on other aspects of the game. The last point to round out the build is going to go into Malefic Momentum. This will be used as a pocket buff to help you fend off mutants and crushers if they manage to break through your front line while you are burning down the horde. You won't be expected to make use of the damage buff from Malefic Momentum a lot since you'll be using your Inferno Staff for 95% of your mission, but when you do need to whip out your melee weapon, it will be empowered to aid you when it counts. With this build complete, let's talk about Rending now, specifically about whether taking Penetration of the Soul, henceforth POTS, is worth it or not. And the short answer is no. Why? Here's a table that logs down the damage difference you get from having a maxed out POTS and not having it at all versus both Carapace and Flak Armor, the key armor types that Rending normally helps you out the most with. Very simply, having POTS at a maximum of 20% Rending triples your Carapace damage output at 15 stacks of Soul Blaze. However, because Soul Blaze has inherently very low damage against Carapace, this 3 times increase is from 12 damage per tick to 36 damage per tick. A Crusher on Damnation has 6,500 health and almost 10,000 in Havoc 40, so this slight marginal increment really isn't going to move the needle that much. And so suffice to say, you won't be relying on the tick damage to bring down Crushers in any meaningful time. For Flak damage, the value of POTS is even worse. It only increases your damage output by 6 at maximum capacity, increasing the Soul Blaze damage at 15 stacks from 179 per tick to 185. In other words, barely any change at all. Even when I include more damage buffs into the equation, the contribution from POTS itself is minuscule at best. Even with Warp Rider, a maxed out POTS, and Vulnerable Minds, you still only deal 50 damage per tick to Crushers, which is 14 more damage than baseline with just POTS alone. At best, with all possible talents, perks, and blessings on this build geared towards Carapace damage, your Soul Blaze is only going to deal around about maybe 140 plus if you can maintain 5 stacks of Blaze away and have all your Warp charges up at the same time. Knowing that the 20% rending provided by pots is basically pointless on the Inferno Staff, this brings into question the purpose of the Penetrating Flames blessing. Should we still use it? Well, 20% rending from pots is the same as 20% brittleness from Penetrating Flames in the terms of damage calculation. Check out my rending video if you want to learn more about that. The main reason you would take Penetrating Flame is not for your own damage output, other than Brain Burst, but to let your team deal more damage to crushers and monsters. Because Penetrating Flame is classified as a unique rending buff, or debuff in this case, it stacks with other sources of brittleness like Rending Shockwave from the Trauma Staff and Shattering Impact on Bolters, for example. So in other words, pots is not really worth the talent point, and Penetrating Flame is meant to help your team deal more damage rather than boosting your own. So hopefully this shines a light on an often asked question when it comes to the Inferno Staff builds. And with that, we've come to the end of this build guide. Feel free to ask and leave any questions in the comments below if you feel like challenging some of the choices here. By all means, I've learned something from the comments of other videos that challenge the way I might approach or think about long-held assumptions and belief, and I welcome more. So, thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Varlets.